this assassination is absolutely incredible, really, on the streets of Moscow.
That was Russia analyst Chris Steele, and he was talking about this bomb planted in a scooter which went off in Moscow, killing a top Russian general. What is going on? We'll find out on this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and on Tuesday we woke up to the news that a Russian general called Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov had been assassinated outside an apartment block in Moscow. And very soon after that, Ukraine said that they were responsible for his death. So there's a big story here and a lot of backstory too. So who better to help us out? He's taking a break from being in Ukraine, but it's the BBC's Kyiv correspondent, James Waterhouse, who is here in the studio. Missing Ukraine?
Very much so. The snow starts to fall. I hear it's wet snow at the moment. And as a Brit, I quite like the cold. It's a novelty.
When do you think you'll be back?
Mid-January, once I'm out of a sling after breaking my collarbone on a bike in London. So, yes, the irony of living and working in a war zone is not lost.
And also welcome back Chris Steele, who former MI6 head of the Russia desk and author of Unredacted, Russia, Trump and the Fight for Democracy. Hello, Chris.
Hello there.
Although we can only buy that in America and Germany, that book at the moment, can't we?
At the moment, although I believe you can get it on Amazon, but don't quote me on that.
Okay, right. So Igor Kirillov, Lieutenant General. James, what do we think happened outside that apartment block?
I think we can say with a fair bit of certainty that we have a senior, high-profile Russian general who, loosely speaking, was in charge of Russia's biological, nuclear and chemical weapons use. He was walking outside his building with his assistant in the early hours this morning, and a scooter that appeared to be packed, according to the Russian authorities, with around 300 grams of explosives was detonated remotely as he walked past, killing them both. You have Ukraine's security service, the SBU, claiming responsibility, and we have a whole host of verified footage that reflects that this did indeed take place. So it is a coup for Ukraine a day after they tried him and convicted him in absentia of using chemical weapons thousands of times in their full-scale invasion.
So yeah, Chris, tell us a little bit more about who this guy was. We've obviously got the job title. James gave us a little hint there about some of the things he's accused of doing. Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, I think the significance of this guy is that he was basically in charge of weapons that should never be used on the battlefield, according to international law. So biological weapons, radiological weapons, chemical weapons. And the accusation has been that the Russians have used this on the Ukraine battlefield. But also, of course, worth bearing in mind that they also assisted the Syrians to use them in Syria. And this guy must have actually played quite a significant role, I would say, in liaison between the Russian military and the Syrian military. And I think it's quite curious, actually, this has happened a week or 2 weeks after the fall of the Syrian regime. And I wonder whether there isn't some Syrian angle to this.
Such as?
Such as maybe discovery of intelligence in Syria or documents in Syria that may have indicated where the guy lived or how he moved about or whatever. I don't know. But I think it is a bit of a coincidence.
Right. But on that, if you are to successfully detonate a bomb like this, you need a lot of surveillance, don't you? You need to know the patterns of this guy, where he's going to be at a certain time. So if it was turned around in a short space of time, it's quite the operation.
And did we know that the Ukrainians were capable of doing something like this?
Adam, they love an assassination, carrying out state assassinations like this, either in occupied territories in Ukraine or Russia itself. We have seen a senior naval officer killed in Crimea. We saw a prison boss in occupied Donetsk region who was killed by a car bomb. We've seen a Russian weapons expert shot dead near his home. Ukraine has claimed responsibility each time. And these are significant in the sense that they rightfully occupy headlines. They take out people of seniority. They send a message to those complicit in Ukraine. But the question mark for me is, what do these individual killings do to Russia's overall full-scale invasion? I think critics over this strategy over time have often asked that very question, because is this going to loosen Russia's grip on the fifth of Ukraine it occupies? Unlikely. But as we've heard, it brings the war to people in Moscow that might otherwise choose to ignore it.
And does that have an effect, Chris, either on the morale of the Russian people or the people who are part of the war effort?
I think the military in Russia have suffered quite a lot recently in terms of purges as well. Not to be forgotten that apart from Shoigu being moved, a whole load of
defense secretary,
generals have been arrested on corruption charges. And this will further sort of demoralise, I think, the senior leadership in the military. So I think the Russian military is not in a good place at the moment. And, they've also lost quite a lot of senior officers actually on the battlefield. There's still a question mark, I believe, over whether the admiral in charge of the Black Sea Fleet was killed or very severely injured last year with the Storm Shadow attack in Sevastopol. So I think that this is a significant attack. It's a high-profile, high-prestige target. And I think it also suggests that Russia is rather complacent about the security surrounding its senior officers. I'm very surprised at the pattern of behaviour and how easy this must have been, actually.
And can you imagine what Russian retaliation might look like? Or is it just more of the same of what they're doing?
Yeah, it is. I mean, at the beginning of the war, we heard that Russia had an assassination hit list in Kiev of various people in the leadership, not just military, but also civilian. But we've not really seen that many successful Russian assassinations in Ukraine, at least. We've had some political ones in Europe, most notably in Berlin, Kashgarvali, or whatever it's called, who was taken out by that assassin Krasikov. But that was before the war anyway. So I think that actually the tempo, interestingly, of Ukraine's assassination program is picking up. Most of the cases that you've just mentioned have taken place in the last few months. So this is a very interesting one to watch in terms of asymmetrical warfare.
James, in terms of the crimes that this guy was accused of in Ukraine, you talk about the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. I hadn't really heard very much about that. Just tell us, paint a picture of what went on there.
So what Ukraine is saying is that on 5,000 occasions, Russia has used chemical weapons illegally, as Chris says, on the battlefield. And one of the agents in question is called chloropicrin. It's this irritant gas that was first used in the First World War. It irritates the eyes, the lungs. It's not thought to be lethal in an open battlefield. But if you think about, if you're sat in a trench and the only way in and out is by foot or by some kind of armoured personnel carrier in the wide open, if these chemicals are deployed, you're forced to run. And time after time, when we speak to troops in the east, they say that would they lose guys when they're moving in and out of the trenches more than ever. It's less so the fighting or storming when losses occur. And so Ukraine is saying this has happened on a huge scale. We've seen soldiers show us footage on their phones showing the canisters used, and we have the US that back up Ukraine's claims of Russia using these weapons in this way. So I think for Ukraine, there's an air of poetry here, an air of catharticism in terms of, pursuing justice in this way. It's trying to send the message that whether or not you end up in a criminal court, your day of reckoning will come. I think that's what Kyiv is trying to do.
And so Ukraine are pitching this as almost like a police action, because I would have thought that targeted assassinations are cloudy in international law, and Ukraine always try and sort of maintain the moral high ground here.
But I think Ukraine would argue that high ground comes under the cover of Russia's full-scale invasion. And as long as Russia is throwing thousands of men at trying to chew up as much Ukrainian territory as possible, as long as it rains down hundreds of drones and missiles continually, this is not like with like. This is Ukraine using, in my mind, a more superior level of intelligence to carry out these kind of attacks. And as Chris was mentioning there, it's hard to make a distinction on the other way by Russia, because when it comes to Russian operations in Ukraine, it's a much blunter instrument that is used because of the tactics described. Before the invasion, Russia had a well-established intelligence network. The problem was the information they were feeding back to Moscow was inaccurate, and that is why Russia suffered the shocks that it did in those early weeks.
I'm just thinking back to the Syria angle on this and the use of chemical weapons. If you think about that in a Syrian context, in 2013, there was a massive parliamentary battle about how to deal with Assad using chemical weapons, and it became a massive transatlantic sticking point between David Cameron and Barack Obama. But yet we've got these weapons being used on the battlefield in Ukraine, and we don't see the same the same international uproar about that. What's going on there? Why is that?
I think the agents that were used in Syria, which I think was sarin particularly, and one or two others, were more obviously chemical weapons. I think Russia's kind of deliberately operating in a slightly sort of grey area here with chemical weapons that maybe aren't lethal. Phosphorus is another one I think that's been used to smoke people out and to get an advantage on the battlefield, which isn't an obvious breach of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But you have to go back a long way with Russia with chemical weapons. I mean, these are weapons, and particularly the biological weapons, that I think the Ukrainians have also claimed that Russia's been using on the battlefield, although there's less evidence of that are outlawed under international law. And therefore, the whole empire, military empire that exists underneath this guy Kirillov is effectively the activities of a rogue state.
And is there also something about how Russia chooses to project power that means they're quite often falling back on chemical weapons? I mean, we've got the big inquiry into what happened in Salisbury with the Skripals and the poisoning there. Like, what is it about the Russian kind of war-fighting psyche that means they reach for these tools?
Yeah, again, as I say, there's a long tradition of this, and the Russian chemical weapons program goes back decades, and so does a biological one. In fact, I remember when I was in Moscow in the 1990s, the revelation that Russia was running a biological weapons program illegally at that time was a big shock to the system and to the government, in fact. So I think there is, you're right, culturally and historically, a dependence on some of these weapons, and I think it's to give them an advantage on the battlefield that is a case of their troops not obeying international law. And one of the things that came out earlier in the conflict, which was really interesting, some of the Russian prisoners of war that were taken clearly hadn't any idea about the Geneva Convention. They were asked about it, they didn't even know what it was. And that relates to the use of these weapons, of course, on the battlefield. They don't actually realise or know that what they're doing is a war crime, which is bizarre.
They're operating in a kind of different moral universe from their opponents.
A vacuum, in fact.
The other half of Kirillov's job description was nuclear weapons. Like, what's a way of thinking about nuclear weapons and the Ukraine invasion?
Well, there was an attempted distinction in 2022 where it was feared that Russia would escalate and use what was called a tactical nuke, a smaller scale bomb that could destroy a sizable chunk of a town and cause thousands of deaths. But ever since then, Vladimir Putin hasn't been shy to rattle the nuclear saber, to constantly remind the West that he is in control of the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So I think that is the extent for me as to the role of nuclear weapons in this war. You have the West fearful of things spilling outside of Ukraine's borders, which it truly has now. You have the West fearful of Russia using more lethal weapons, and you have Russia looking to play to those anxieties. Why? Because it directly affects the speed and scale of support that Ukraine receives. So I think that is as far as it goes when it comes to this general's portfolio.
And I think another important point there, and something that we understand to be the case, that the Chinese have been a big restraint on Russia talker and considering of using nuclear weapons on the battlefield. The Chinese have told the Russians that they mustn't use these weapons. And because Russia and Putin are so dependent now on China, both economically and politically, it would take an awful lot, I think, to raise the conflict to a point where Putin felt he had to use a nuclear weapon.
And talking about Russia's allies, there's been lots of reports the last few days about what these North Korean troops are actually doing, and the idea being that they're there to help the Russian effort in the Kursk region, which is the bit of Russia that Ukraine surprised everyone by invading a few months ago. James, what do we think we know there?
So we've got to keep an eye on the scale of what we're talking about here. We've got the US and Ukraine saying the first North Korean soldiers have been killed in Russia's Kursk region, in this small patch of territory that Ukraine seized back in August. There is a whole host of content online appearing to show Asian soldiers in Russian uniforms lying dead. Kyiv is saying that around 30 soldiers are known to have been killed so far. When we're talking about reported Russian losses of 1,200 a day, that gives you an idea of the small scale we're talking about. We've also got the West saying these North Korean soldiers are fair game. They are legitimate targets if they are taking part in this invasion. What this has always been is more geopolitically significant, because the involvement of North Korean soldiers is a symptom of how Russia with its new relationship with China, with its steepening relationship with North Korea, with its continued relationship with Iran, it's an example of how this new axis of power is trying to continue to upset the traditionally Western-dominated world order. So that's a bit big picture-y, but nevertheless, the sight of a dead North Korean soldier is still significant for that reason.
And coming back in on that, actually, there are suggestions that the Chinese are not at all happy about the deployment of North Korean troops in Russia. And I suspect that, one of the Rubicons there is whether the North Koreans actually start fighting on internationally recognised Ukrainian soil, as opposed to what we think they're doing at the moment, which is operating on internationally recognised Russian soil. So that will be an interesting element. But as I say, apparently both, certainly South Korea, but also China, not at all happy with this as an escalation of the war.
And the reason for that is because you suddenly get these soldiers exposed to new technologies and they become battle hardened. And when you have soldiers that are exposed to active warfare, that makes them a very different security proposition.
How do you mean?
Because if we look at most of the world now, if we look at the British armed forces at the moment, we're not, broadly speaking, involved in any kind of war or operation. So soldiers predominantly take part in humanitarian work. They go through exercises, relentless training, all of that you would associate. But there is a huge difference between that and active operations where you are engaging enemy troops and, with all of those associated risks.
And I think you have to underline just how bizarre this situation is. Even a couple of years ago, if you'd suggested that there would be a battle going on inside Russia between North Korean troops and Ukrainian troops, I think people would have thought you needed to wake up and smell the coffee. So there's a very strange set of relationships developing here. This war has developed in the most extraordinary ways. This assassination is absolutely incredible, really, on the streets of Moscow, a full general in that position. And I think there'll be a lot of surprises to come before this conflict is over.
I saw Donald Trump did a big kind of press moment yesterday in Mar-a-Lago where he talked about lots of things, one of which was the future of Ukraine. James, what's a way of interpreting what he said? And also, it's always quite hard to work out what Trump might even be getting at with just when you actually just look at what he says.
Of course. I mean, my sense was that I think he's been presented with more intelligence. He's seen footage of destroyed towns and battlefields and bodies strewn across the snowy
And basically he was
grass.
saying, why would Ukraine even want to have this territory back because it's been reduced to rubble?
Yeah, I think so. From that, I thought, right, he's seen the contrast between some of these eastern towns that have been destroyed close to the front line and the major cities like Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kiev and Odessa in the south, for example. He said it was horrible. He said there's very little progress in trying to bring this war to a stop, but, a deal needs to happen. He reiterated his desire to end this war quickly. He suggested that Russia had left Kiev alone, undamaged, because it wanted to occupy it or control it in the long run, which I think reflects that he understands Vladimir Putin's continued maximalist aims of looking to invade the whole of Ukraine. There was a slight moment that confused me where he said, look, 4 years ago, Russia wouldn't have even been in Ukraine, if I had been in power. Well, he would have known in his first term that Russia was in Ukraine. It had invaded Crimea and its proxies were waging an 8-year war in eastern Ukraine, and he had signed off the first US weapons package for Ukraine. So I think that would have irked a few Ukrainian ears listening to that. But I think the stark characteristics of this war, I think, are dawning on him, but I don't think there's a change in his position on wanting to bring this to a swift end. The question is how on earth you get Ukraine, who says, I want complete liberation, and Vladimir Putin, who for now is saying, I want complete control of 4 provinces, how you get those two parties to meet in the middle.
Chris, do you want to do some Trump whispering for us?
Oh, probably the wrong person to ask.
Yeah, you do have a bit of history there.
Being entirely objective about it. I think the problem is that they're probably talking past each other, Trump and Putin will be, because I think Trump sees this as some kind of real estate deal, which is about land and assets. And actually for Putin, it's much bigger than that. It's about his legacy. It's about neutralizing Ukraine, both as an independent country, but also, I think, very importantly, as an alternative model for development of a post-Soviet republic. It's always been that fundamentally at the heart of it. And I'm not sure Trump...
In other words, becoming too European.
Well, as in other words, being an attractive model for the Russian people themselves to follow, rather than the one they're being pushed down at the moment, which is autocracy, and which is allying themselves with some of the worst rogue states in the world. So I think the problem is that Putin's objectives in this have grown over time. He's very ambitious in what he wants to achieve in Ukraine. He doesn't have the capabilities militarily or economically to achieve that. So he's hoping that Trump makes a mistake and allows him to recoup and to rearm and all the rest of it over time. And the echoes there, of course, of the 1930s are quite striking.
So interesting. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And James, good luck with your recovery for your shoulder.
Thank you.
Now, just a warning that you might find some of the details coming up in the second half of this episode of Newscast potentially disturbing, because we're going to talk about the death of 10-year-old Sara Sharif. Last week, her father Irfan, her stepmother Baynash were found guilty of her murder, and her uncle Faisal was found guilty of causing or allowing her death. Today, all three of them received their sentences. Her father got a minimum term of 40 years behind bars, her stepmother 33 years minimum term, and there was 16 years sentence for Faisal Malik. Separately, the government also published its new legislation, which is designed to stop children falling between the gaps between homeschooling, schooling, and the social services, which seems to be what happened in Sara's case. So lots to discuss with the Children's Commissioner for England, Dame Rachel de Souza, who is here in the Newscast studio. Hello, Rachel.
Hi.
So I didn't listen to the judge's remarks today. I've just been reading the reports and heard a little bit of it on the radio. But you listened to the whole thing on your headphones. What was it like?
Do you know, it was absolutely harrowing. We'd all read the stories of her sort of been battered and her sort of last tortured few days and hours. But the judge did an amazing job in taking us right through it, really describing what been tortured in pure daylight, in the middle of it, what that was like. And though it was so harrowing, I have to say I stopped and cried.
Right. Why do you think he wanted to go into that level of detail? Because that's not easy for anyone to listen to.
Well, I mean, I think he's doing his job, and I mean, he was summing up, and I think we must never ever forget that this level of depravity and wickedness exists, and if we're going to protect children, sometimes, unfortunately, we're having to protect them from that. And we all want to. You can't help it. You want to think the best or turn your head away, but when the judge talked about her very last hours and about how she was floppy. So her stepmother called father home and she was obviously dying in his arms. And instead of calling the emergency services, he picked up a pole and beat her in the stomach, and then she died. That level of depravity and wickedness and what that poor girl experienced is, we need to hear it.
But we should also say, though, the judge kind of went out of his way to pay sort of an amazing tribute to her about what she was like as a little girl, and just what, I hate to fall back on a cliche, but like what a ray of sunshine she was to everyone else, despite what she was going through at home.
And I think one of the things, I thought that was beautiful, but I think also one of the things he really made everybody feel and really aware of was the imbalance of power. This was a violence against a girl because she was a girl. Because she stood up to him. And it was quite horrific to think about that level of violence against a girl for being a girl. And we have to recognise that.
Let's talk about then the other thing that happened today, which is the government's publication of this new legislation, which will look to try and secure the well-being or improve the well-being of children across the UK, although some of it is only in England. Quite a few things to talk about. First of all, this phenomenon of children being taken out of school, homeschooling, how will that be different if this legislation gets passed and is implemented? So
I think people might be quite surprised that you can. So there is any parent has the right in this country to home educate, and there are many who do that really well with the best of intentions. But I think what people would be surprised at is that there is no duty, or there wasn't until the bill today, to keep a register of who's home educated. And I think this has been a long coming change in legislation. I'm really pleased to see it. I've really pushed 5 secretaries of state to bring this in. I'm really pleased that it's now there. But one of the most important things for me is if a child is at risk and known to be at risk of abuse by social services, now they cannot be home educated. And for me, the well-being of the child, the safeguarding of the child outweighs anyone's right to home educate.
And presumably the government had a few options for kind of like the threshold at which that would kick in.
Yeah.
Are you happy that they've set that at the right threat, or could they've gone a bit further?
Look, the devil's in the detail. So I'm pleased it's there. I want to make sure, and when I see that, because we haven't seen it all the sort of all of the how it will work underneath, my real worry is that this must not be optional based on what a local authority or a social worker say, because Sara's case shows us there were many, many missteps. It should just be by the people who were the services that were meant to support her. So I think what we need to see is that if a child is known to social services to be at risk, they just cannot be home educated. That's part of the law, and that it needs to be a complete red line. That would, have... Sara might be alive now had she been under the eyes of her school. We can't underestimate. You go to school to learn. You also go to school for fun, but you also go to school to be safe. And the worst thing is a child who is at risk of being abused, isn't being abused, and are not allowed to be home educated. What's worse that happens? They go to school. That's not a bad thing.
But isn't there a danger that you can set up a massive confrontation between parents and schools if the parents disagree with the school, thinking that there's a risk here?
Well, trust me.
And then you get a child who's caught up in a big legal battle between the school and their mum and dad.
Look, that absolutely, we have to think through all those unintended consequences. And trust me, abusers, let alone people where they've been falsely accused of abuse, but abusers will try to have a confrontation as well. It is difficult, but what is the worst that we're asking of people that their child goes to school? I think it's worth the risk while things get settled. And if there, I have to say, it's such a high threshold. There are so many children who are slipping under the radar that I'm actually not worried about what you've just described. I'm worried about children being missed.
Yeah, I'm just sort of trying to think through the logic, like looking at it from a few angles, because also that's what will happen in Parliament now, because this is just the bill kind of being introduced. There'll be a lot of discussion and votes and different stages, and it may be amended as we go along. We were on Newsnight together a few nights ago, and one of the things you were talking about was there should be a unique identification number for each child who's kind of in the system for child protection reasons. Just explain why that would be such a good thing. And because the government sound like they're going to go down that route.
Actually, not just for every child.
Oh, for every child.
Yeah.
I misunderstood. I thought it was just people where there was a risk or something.
So look, in this day and age, 21st century, look how good like tech is. I go and buy something online. Everybody knows what I've bought, and I get offered all sorts of things. Why are we not harnessing this level of tech to support children? So basically, you're born, you get an NHS number. You also go to school, you get a different number for school. If you're involved with the police, if your parents are, you'd have a police number. If you have a variety of different designators, and they don't talk to each other. So really, it doesn't make sense in this day and age that it's so siloed. Where this really came home to me was when I went to, it was Bedfordshire, to talk to the police station. And they said, we've got this spreadsheet of children that we found who are not on any school roll or are not anywhere. And I'm like, well, who are they? And they were like, well, we don't know because we don't.
And that only existed in that police force.
Yeah. And so it's really, it will help all of us. So we're not having to completely retell our stories or worry that does the school know, does health know, does whatever, particularly when there are attendance issues and other issues. But it would support all of us with our children, support all of our children, but particularly children at risk. Because you would have known that she was. If you look at Sara's case, the school contacted social care. The social worker visited the home. She wasn't there. The family had moved, so they closed the case 6 days later. Now, had the unique identifier been working and had the data systems been working properly with it, they would have known that she was known to social services.
No, but in that
before
case,
her
isn't
birth.
that just a social worker kind of giving up too easily? That's not this. That's just a bad kind of decision.
The inquest may well say that's the case, but it probably one factor is that when you move out of your local authority area, you're often gone and lost. You would be surprised how little we know about where children are, especially when they cross boundary lines like their local authority. So it would allow authorities to talk to each other. So it may well be the social worker gave up too soon. We have to wait to see. But I can guarantee you that there would be a data issue that social worker didn't have in front of them because of the weak data systems, didn't have in front of them both her health record or the fact that she was known to social care before her birth and all the different times she'd been into foster care.
Again, I'm
And
just trying to...
It's crazy.
I'm
It's
just trying to think,
crazy.
but I'm just again trying to think of like all the counter arguments might be made as this legislation goes through Parliament, and I can imagine some MPs and some parents saying, "Well, hang on, this sort of changes the balance about who's responsible for a child. Is it the parents or is it the state?" And this is tipping that further in the direction of the states by giving it to every child rather than just children where there's a risk
But
or
the
the
thing
system's
is,
flagged them up.
Every child has an NHS number. Isn't it as simple as we all use the NHS number? You have a national insurance number, and you use it right the way through your life. It really is just that. But in these really difficult cases where children are known to social care or are at risk of exploitation, or you suddenly find children in a house who've never been to school. Have they been to their GP? Do we know who they are? So it just helps us keep everybody safe. I've heard the arguments around privacy and all this, but I just don't think they make sense given that we live our lives on our mobile phones. And frankly, businesses, Google knows more about you than so I mean, why not make the services work properly?
And also, you can join Instagram if you're 13. You can be on social media if you're 13, and that's linking you to all sorts of things in your life. One of the other things you're campaigning for is a change in the law in England about smacking, because at the moment you're allowed to reasonably chastise a child in England, and you want to get rid of that altogether.
So, look, I think we kind of trivialize this by talking about smacking because nobody is interested in like getting into normal loving parents' lives who might have to grab a toddler off a road, or those things are really kind of normal, natural things. And most of us who are parents will remember, oh God, I remember the time I did that and I really regret it. Most of us are good actors, we're doing our best for our children. I'm talking about Irfan Sharif and other abusers being able to say, I have a defence in law against what I did to this child. I'm allowed to legally chastise, to reasonably chastise this child. And then that been going too far. And I know that people will say, well, that wouldn't have stopped Irfan Sharif. Well, if he knew when he came here, or if any abuser here knew that you were not allowed to hit children, no way, and it would be picked up straight away and it was illegal, it might keep more children safe and might stop it. And I find it crazy that a dog has more rights in the law. We as adults have more rights in the law than our vulnerable children.
I mean, why do you think you've had to fight for that for so long?
Well, I think there's
what is it about the culture of, I don't know, governing in Britain or parenting in Britain that means that still exists?
Well, nobody wants the state sort of meddling in the kind of upbringing of their children or their personal lives, and I absolutely understand that, and I kind of agree, really agree. But I do think Scotland and Wales has done this. They've banned this. It hasn't meant that normal parents are
being criminalised.
Criminalised. It really has not meant that. But what it has meant is a few cases where children were beaten, have gone to court. So I've been watching really, really carefully. And in fact, I'm writing to the Prime Minister about this today to talk to explain what the evidence is and to encourage him to move on this.
Well, yeah, because this package of measures today does not include that.
It does
so
not.
the government had an option of doing that today, and they haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would take far more debate, because this is about, you know, something really fundamental, about, you know, how about the legal system, whereas the package of measures today are very much about the school and social care system. But I do think it's important, and I don't want to turn away from it, because I think, you know, there are two. If you just look at this case, there's not only what Irfan Sharif said, but there's also the people who heard the blood-curdling screams and then they went quiet. So should we do anything? Should
well,
we
that
not
was going to
do
be
anything?
my final question to you. Like, and I mean, okay, you called me out for my use of the word smacking, but the word I was going to use was busybody. Like, do we need to all become more busybodies? And of course, as soon as I say that, that's putting a negative slant on people intervening in children's welfare. But do you think we need to become all as a society a bit more prepared to intervene in our next door neighbors' lives or our more distant relatives, how they bring up our relatives, or what do you think we need a culture change in about British privacy?
Look, I think this case is very confronting, because, you know, lots of people said, well, you know, we heard it, but we didn't do anything. She started wearing the hijab, but we thought, well, maybe that's okay. People were as Brits, we're often really we don't want to mess in other people's business. We want to allow people to have their privacy. But what I think is, if we've got schools as really, you know, real safeguarding partners, so we need our teachers, our social workers, the people around children to be curious about their lives. The really deeply upsetting thing, you know, one of the deeply upsetting things about Sara's case is, you know, the abuse had become normalized. So she, you know, she wrote letters to, you know, her father and her stepmother, saying she loved them and saying how wonderful they were. For her, it become normalized. She wasn't just going to go say, oh, this is happening to me at home. It needed the adults around her to be curious and to ask the questions. So I don't think it's about being a busybody. I think it's about being curious, asking the questions. And yeah, if you hear a blood-curdling scream, phone the police. Do it.
And also, I mean, I haven't looked into this. I don't know the details, but Sara's siblings are now in Pakistan. Do you think there's a danger that becomes a sort of international diplomatic spat or incident?
So I don't know. Obviously, the details. The judge outlined, you know, in no uncertain terms, that the children have been taken away from the support from the only homes they knew to be placed there. It seems to me the international agencies were working well together, and clearly, you know, enough pressure was put on to get these murderers back home to face justice, and I doubt they came back on their own. I think the welfare and well-being of the children is the most important thing. A couple of them have got special needs. I do think a unique identifier that we were talking about, if that was shared properly with Border Force, would have stopped them leaving the country in the first place.
And last question, we're coming up to Christmas, which for most people is a happy time. I just wondered, for you as the Children's Commissioner in England, do you go into Christmas actually being quite worried because it's a time when children are maybe trapped in unsafe environments because they're off school for 2 weeks?
It's true, and it's also a time when our most vulnerable children, who might be living away from home, really feel that desperate need to go home and try to be with their families, even if they're in quite abusive situations. So it is a difficult time. And even though today we're talking about failings in social care, and the failings in the safety net around Sara, I think it's appropriate for us to thank those who work in social care, who will be looking after those children, those most vulnerable children, over the Christmas period when these really difficult and extreme things can happen. And I just hope everyone, frankly, I wept today, and I just hope we can all make never again really mean never again. And that's a New Year's resolution for us all.
And thanks to you for coming in today.
Thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.